daily routine, presenting and reading petitions, presenting reports of committees. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Chair of the Committee on Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bills: Bill number 30, Bill number 52, Bill number 55, and Bill number 78. The committee recommends these bills to the favourable consideration of the House with amendments.
Order that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Chair of the Committee for Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bill. Bill number 79. The committee recommends this bill to the favourable consideration of the House without amendment.
Order that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to present the Nova Scotia Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Review Office's 2011 annual report.
The report is tabled. Statements by ministers. The Honourable the Premier on an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce to the House of Assembly today Lee and Shannon Ferrier from Toronto, who are in your gallery. Lee Ferrier is a retired Superior Court Justice for the province of Ontario and is serving on the Pension Appeals Board, which is taking place in Halifax this week. And Shannon is a former teacher and published author, having penned the award-winning Kids in the Kitchen cookbook series with her sister Tamara Shuttleworth, and is a multi-award winner in many disciplines year after year at the prestigious Dunchurch Fair, and you'll see their setting with a familiar face around the house, Kelly Fawcett. Shannon is Kelly's aunt. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask the House to welcome our guest today.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. Statements by ministers. Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place today to talk about one of the deadliest mining disasters in this country's history. A tragic event that resulted in an improved approach to the protection of Nova Scotia's health and safety and greater awareness of safety issues. The Westray mining disaster is a tragedy that continues to haunt workers and their families in the community of Plymouth, throughout Pictou County, and right across Nova Scotia, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, this country. As all the members here are aware, today marks 20 years since a massive explosion ripped through the mine, killing 26 men who were working underground at the time. It was 5:18 a.m. on May 9th, 1992, when people miles away from the mine felt the ground shake under their feet. Windows shattered and houses trembled from the force of the explosion. Then, Nova Scotians received the terrible news. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that I speak for most everyone in this room when I say I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I heard the news. And like so many other Canadians, I remember watching anxiously in the days after as rescue crews worked desperately to find someone alive. Sadly, Nova Scotia lost 26 good men that day, 26 fathers, 26 brothers, 26 sons, 26 husbands, who would never again return home to their loved ones. Mr. Speaker, this devastating disaster has left a scar on our province, on the communities in Pictou County, and on so many workers and their families here in Nova Scotia and across Canada. The incredible response and support for the rescue teams and the local community was evidence of the deep feelings about the Westray disaster. I'd like to thank members of the labour movement, especially the United Steelworkers, who are hosting a memorial ceremony this evening in New Glasgow for their ongoing support and efforts to honor this tragedy. Almost 20 years has gone by. Those lost are most certainly not forgotten. This tragedy stands as one of the most sobering reminders of the potentially deadly cost of an unsafe workplace. In the aftermath of the disaster, the province established a commission of inquiry to review the factors that contributed to this unthinkable outcome. Mr. Speaker, as many of the members know, this review resulted in the Westray Inquiry Report, which included 74 recommendations to improve workplace health and safety, particularly in the mining industry. And the majority of those recommendations were addressed with the implementation of the underground mining regulations in 2003. Successive governments have made significant improvements and took steps to make sure that the full force of the law was felt in support of this national goal. Today, Nova Scotians across the province, but particularly those in Pictou County, will gather to remember those who were killed. I know not a single day has gone by where the community in this province haven't felt the weight of this incredible loss. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that Nova Scotians have made a commitment that together we will ensure that Westray is never forgotten. And together, we will stay vigilant to make sure that something like this never happens again. During this, the North American Occupational Health and Safety Week, we owe it to the brave, hard-working men who were killed on this day 20 years ago. In fact, we owe it to all the men and women and young people who have been hurt, gotten sick, or died on the job in this province. Even one incident is too many. Workplace safety is everyone's responsibility. It must be made a priority in all workplaces across Nova Scotia. We have made progress, but that doesn't mean that we are done. I urge employers and employees not to be complacent. Workplace health and safety is something you need to work hard to achieve every day. We cannot undo the past, but we can certainly learn from it. To the people of Pictou County, the surviving workers, and the families and friends of those killed, our thoughts are with you on this and every day. Nova Scotia will never forget. I would like to leave the members with a quote from the Westray Report, Mr. Speaker, a line from a French sociologist, which I find particularly poignant on this anniversary. It says, "The most important thing to come out of a mine is the miner." The men lost that dark day will never again emerge to breathe fresh air and feel the sunshine on their face. Mr. Speaker, if I may, after the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Conservative Party have had an opportunity to respond to this statement, I would ask that the members of the House observe a moment of silence now to honor those men who were lost. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the Premier for an advanced copy of his remarks, and I think all members of the House want to associate ourselves with his remarks today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise on behalf of the Liberal caucus and join all members of this legislature, and indeed all Nova Scotians, in remembering the victims of the Westray mining disaster. On May 9, 1992, at 5:18 a.m., 20 years ago today, a spark in the southeast corner of the mine ignited, Mr. Speaker, a cloud of methane gas, triggering an explosion that trapped and killed 26 miners. For many of us, both inside and outside this legislature, we were once again reminded of the dangers of coal mining, Mr. Speaker. But this modern-day reminder should never have happened. Mr. Speaker, all of us, each and every Nova Scotian, witnessed the triumph of the human spirit in the face of this inconsolable tragedy. As media stories beamed to the world, letters and donations poured in while families waited for the word of their loved ones. Communities throughout Pictou County provided much needed nurturing. Volunteers and staff of community centres, fire departments, relief agencies, and the clergy provided food, care, and spiritual support. And in their darkest days, draggermen pushed through the devastation, leaving bare-faced miners the heart-wrenching task of carrying the bodies of their friends and co-workers. 96 of them in total did the unthinkable. They remained true to their valiant traditions despite their own grief, and were later honored by the Governor-General of the day with bravery medals. The Honourable Ray Natition described their efforts best in the investiture when he said, and I quote, "Look about you. The faces you see are the faces of decent people who did not want to have to be heroes, but heroes they are," end of quote. As legislators, we are left with the task of ensuring history never repeats itself. While legislative changes for the better happened after Westray, there is still work to be done. Speaker, while ensuring legislation and policies are followed is our job, we must never forget why it is important that the job gets done. We must never forget the 26 men who lost their lives at Westray. We must never forget their wives, their children, their parents, and their brothers and sisters. The challenge for each of us is to work diligently to ensure history does not repeat itself. Mr. Speaker, at the Westray Monument, the inscription reads, and I quote, "Their light shall always shine," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, our thoughts and prayers are with the family and friends of those 26 miners, not only today, but every day, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier for a copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in my place and join my fellow Nova Scotians as we remember the 20th anniversary of the Westray mine disaster. In the early morning of May 9th, 1992, a tragic explosion took the lives of 26 hard-working Nova Scotians. I certainly offer my sincere condolences and the condolences of the Progressive Conservative Caucus, and I'm sure all members of this House, to the families who lost their husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons on that fateful day. We pray that time has helped to heal their sorrow, and these families are able to find comfort in fond memories of their lost loved ones. To the fellow miners and community members who worked tirelessly to recover those lost, your heroic actions continue to inspire us even 2 decades later. Like many Nova Scotians, I too remember watching your efforts hour by hour during those fateful days. Westray was the worst mining disaster in our country since 1958, when 75 men died in a coal mine in Spring Hill. And so, Mr. Speaker, as the MLA for Cumberland South, I know how a community can be forever changed by such a disaster. But I've also witnessed the resilience of a community that rallies together to grow beyond the grief. The tragedy at Westray and the following inquiry into its cause shone a bright light on the shortcomings and shortcuts that create a dangerous workplace. It led to legislation that made it clear where responsibilities lay when it comes to the operation of a safe workplace. For government, for industry, and all Nova Scotians today, better awareness of workplace safety and increased vigilance is a goal that we all share. As a father myself, my thoughts are especially with the children of Westray. Now adults, many with families of their own. I hope they have been able to remember the good times they shared with their fathers, and that those memories may bring them some peace. I hope, too, that they come to see that their fathers did not die in vain. And it is for them and the loved ones they leave behind that we, as a country and as a province, remain committed to providing the safest work conditions possible. In his report on the disaster, Mr. Justice Peter Richards said, and I quote, "The Westray story is a complex mosaic of actions, omissions, mistakes, incompetence, apathy, cynicism, stupidity, and neglect." That may tell the story of the tragic accident itself, but it does not tell the story of the 26 men who lost their lives and the 117 fellow miners whose lives were forever changed. I am reminded, Mr. Speaker, of an individual story that I have come to know personally, not from Westray, but from the Spring Hill bump, which I will share briefly with the House. And that is the experience of a man I have come to know as a friend, Mr. Herb Pepperdine, who was one of the last surviving members of the Great Spring Hill Bump of 58. Mr. Pepperdine spent 9 days trapped underground with his fellow miners, waiting to be rescued. He had nothing more than 1 bottle of water and 1 chocolate bar for that time. And he shared that with his fellow miners. I was there, Mr. Speaker, when Mr. Pepperdine shared his story with my own daughter. And what we both remember most from his incredible experience, recognizing he was one of the survivors, although his life was forever changed, was that weeks later, when he got his final paycheck, the company had cut his payoff at exactly 8 p.m., the moment that the bump occurred in the Spring Hill mine. And I say that today, Mr. Speaker, because the lesson of Herb Pepperdine, the lesson of miners in Spring Hill, and the lessons from Westray are that workers deserve fair pay for fair work. They deserve a safe workplace. They deserve to return home at night from their job. They deserve to be compensated fairly when they are injured. And they deserve a legislature and a House of Commons that put in place all the appropriate rules and regulations to make all those things come true. And that is what we think about as we remember Westray today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I would ask all members now to stand for a moment of silence. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 20 years ago on this date, May 9th, 1992, 26 miners lost their lives in an underground explosion at the Westray Colliery in Plymouth, Nova Scotia. And whereas Nova Scotians will always remember with sadness the 26 men, husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers, lost their lives in the Westray mine explosion. And whereas the Westray tragedy will forever be one of the darker days in the history of this province and stands as a sobering reminder of the potentially terrible costs of unsafe work practices. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House honor the memory of the 26 men who tragically lost their lives in the Westray mine disaster on Saturday, May 9th, 1992, and through our combined commitment to safety, help ensure that tragedies like this never happen again. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas nurses from one corner of our province to the other are hardworking and dedicated to patient care and our healthcare system, and this week, May 7th to 13th, marks National Nursing Week with the theme of nursing, the health of our nation. And whereas on May the 2nd, 11 nurses from across the province were honored for their excellence at the College of Registered Nurses of Nova Scotia annual general meeting, And whereas recipients were awarded for their contributions in the areas of nursing administration, nursing clinical practice, and nursing education, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in recognizing National Nursing Week, our recipients, and the valuable work and contributions that the more than 10,000 nurses and 3,560 licensed practical nurses across Nova Scotia provide each and every day to the people of the province. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas over the past 18 years, Dr. Bernie MacDonald has been a guiding force at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College. And whereas Dr. MacDonald has been instrumental in shaping NSAC and helping to create the world-class institution we know today. And whereas Dr. MacDonald has recently decided to retire after a long and successful career with the public service. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank Dr. Bernie MacDonald for his years of dedicated service at Nova Scotia Agricultural College and wish him well in his retirement. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver, notice, and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas journalists provide a vital service in informing Nova Scotians of news, good and bad, in their neighbourhood and around the world, and journalists are often called upon to explain a complex issue in a way that is easy to understand and relevant to the reader or listener. And whereas journalism students from the University of King's College in Halifax are among 58 projects vying for a Global Editors Network Data Journalism Award in an international competition sponsored by Google and organized with the European Journalism Centre for their interactive project called 902-911, which mapped 650,000 calls to Halifax Regional Police by street and the nature of the call into an easy-to-navigate and understand format. And whereas Jeff Bird, Ezra Black, Alex Boats, Shenley Brown, Dane Butler, Tim Vander Koy, Andre Dese, Corbett Hansey, Patrick Odell, Lily Sangster, Brittany Teasdale, and faculty advisor Fred Valance-Jones, therefore, are up for that award. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate the University of King's College and investigative journalism students and offer them heartfelt congratulations and best wishes for a successful outcome when the winners are announced on May 31st during the News World Summit in Paris. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas mental health for all will be this year's theme for the Canadian Mental Health Association's 61st Mental Health Week. And whereas May 7th to 13th, which marks Mental Health Week 2012, will encourage Canadians from all walks of life to learn, talk, reflect, and engage with others on issues to mental health. And whereas the Canadian Mental Health Association, one of the oldest voluntary organizations in Canada, provides direct services to more than 100,000 Canadians through more than 10,000 volunteers and staff in more than 140 communities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize May 7th to 13th as National Mental Health Week, and acknowledge the long-standing contribution of the Canadian Mental Health Association and its volunteers in helping those living with a mental illness. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm reading this resolution on behalf of the Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs. Thank you. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cornwallis Street Baptist Church, located in Halifax, has served as a beacon of light for residents and others far and wide since 1832. And whereas Cornwallis Street Baptist Church has been in the forefront not only in spiritual leadership, but as a vanguard in the struggle for human rights and social development in African Nova Scotian communities throughout our province. And whereas the 180th anniversary celebration for Cornwallis Street Baptist Church under the theme Moving Forward will take place May 18th, 2012 to May 20th, 2012 with a banquet at the Westin Nova Scotian Hotel and a special service at the church. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly Cornwallis Street Baptist Church for 180 years of dedicated service and ministry and extends our sincerest congratulations on this historic anniversary celebration. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
The Honourable Member for Richmond begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Bill number 85, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide Protection for the New Page Port Hawkesbury Pension Plans. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide Protection for the New Page Port Hawkesbury Pension Plan.
Bill number 86, entitled An Act to Provide Protection for the New Page Port Hawkesbury Pension Plans.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 114 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Crown Lands Act, to enable good forestry management on Crown land.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 114 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Crown Lands Act, to enable good forestry management on Crown land.
Bill number 87, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 114 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Crown Lands Act, to enable good forestry management on Crown land.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to ensure regulatory review of the Maritime Link.
The Honourable Minister of Energy begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Ensure Regulatory Review of the Maritime Link.
Bill number 88, entitled An Act to Ensure Regulatory Review of the Maritime Link.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today is the 20th anniversary of the tragic West Ray mine explosion in which 26 miners were killed and the lives of their families and communities were forever changed. And whereas Nova Scotians will always remember the way community and all Nova Scotians came together to mourn the loss of their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons. And whereas this tragedy and the inquiry that followed showed Nova Scotians the necessity for government, industry, and all workplaces to put safety first and foremost in our minds, therefore it be it resolved the members of the House of Assembly respect and honor the memory of those who perished at West Ray and ensure that their memory continues to inspire vigilance for safety in the workplace in our province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the West Ray mine disaster was a devastating event that will be forever etched in the memory of all Nova Scotians. Whereas at 5:18 a.m. on Saturday, May 9th, 1992, the West Ray mine exploded, killing 26 miners in the worst mining disaster in Canada since 1958. And whereas the 20th anniversary of the disaster is being marked today at solemn ceremonies, which began at 6:45 a.m. at West Ray Memorial Park, and will conclude this evening with the ceremony at 7 p.m. at the Miners' Memorial in Sellerton. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House remember the 26 miners who lost their lives in the West Ray mine and extend ongoing sympathy to the families as they cherish the memories of their loved ones throughout today. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I read this on behalf of the member from Cape Breton, Nova. All right. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Saturday, April 7th, 2012, Ed McKillop, well known as a boxer and as a member of the Royal Canadian Regiment and Black Watch, passed away. And whereas Ed was inducted in the Canadian Forces Boxing Hall of Fame, Canadian Boxing Hall of Fame, World Boxing Hall of Fame, the Cape Breton Heritage Sports Hall of Fame, and the Oromocto Wall of Fame. And whereas Ed held the titles of Cape Breton Lightweight Golden Gloves Champion, the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade Middleweight Champion, the Canadian Army Middleweight Champion, and the Central Command Middleweight Champion, the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade Middleweight Champion, the Canadian Army Light Heavyweight Champion, and the Eastern Command Middleweight Champion. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize Ed McKillop for his fighting exploits in and out of the ring and extend our deepest sympathy to the members of late Ed McKillop. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas His Beatitude Patriarch Mar Bashara Boutros Rai, the Maronite Patriarch of Antioch and all the Orient, is the head of the Maronite Church, one of the principal religions of Lebanon. And whereas many Nova Scotians of Lebanese descent are Maronite Christians, and whereas the Patriarch arrived in Nova Scotia last evening and was honoured with a banquet hosted by Father Pierre Azi, pastor of Our Lady of Lebanon Church, a dinner which lasted into the wee hours of this morning. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House of Assembly thank the Patriarch for honouring Nova Scotia with his visit and congratulate his parishioners on their significant visitor. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice set on a future date. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 2012, the Brooklyn Volunteer Fire Department in Hants West is celebrating 50 years of service, and thanks to the addition of new equipment, is even better equipped for emergencies. And whereas members of the department are logging extra training hours in anticipation of about 2,700 new residences being built in the area, for which both the Brooklyn and Mount Uniacke Volunteer Fire Departments will be responsible. And whereas the Brooklyn Volunteer Fire Department responded to 193 calls for service in 2011, including 86 medical assists, 13 chimney fires, 8 structure fires, and 4 requests for mutual aid. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the members of the Brooklyn Fire Department on 50 years of service and thank them for their dedication and commitment to the residents of Brooklyn and surrounding areas. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Raymond Charles Ross, known to all as Ray Ross, served as a school crossing guard for 20 years, protecting and assisting children at the corner of Gottingen and K Streets on their way to St. Joseph's Alexander McKay School in Halifax's North End. And whereas Ray Ross passed away suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 74 on April the 28th, 2012. And whereas Ray Ross was so well loved by the children and families he helped safely cross the street that they have posted notes, pictures, and flowers and other symbolic items at Ray's corner to express their appreciation and sorrow. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly thank Ray Ross posthumously for his dedication to the children he helped over the course of 2 decades and extend our sympathy for their loss to Ray's family and to all the children and families whose lives he touched. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Robert Wright Alexander Boyd passed away on May 4th, 2012 after a valiant battle with cancer. And whereas Bob was a valuable, long-serving employee of our province with the Department of Tourism. And whereas Bob's friendly and professional manner made working with him a pleasure. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank Bob for all he has done for our Nova Scotia tourism industry and extend our condolences to the love of his life, Kim Jardine, and to his mother, Jean. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas an entire career at the same organization is increasingly a rare thing, and whereas Charlotte Harvey of Kennecook is retiring after work at Hants North Rural High School in administration for 43.5 years. And whereas on June 10, 2012, a retirement celebration will be held for her at Hants North High Regional High School. And therefore, be resolved that this House of Assembly congratulates Charlotte Harvey on her retirement after 43 years and thanks her for her career-long service to her local school and to education. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the heritage sector is a very important part of Nova Scotia's creative economy, and our museums, art galleries, and archives are valued by Nova Scotians and all Canadians. And whereas the Shambhala archives are an integral part of the Shambhala Buddhist community, not just here in Nova Scotia, but around the world, and serve as a repository of film, audio, and video recordings, photographs, negatives, transparencies, manuscripts, transcripts, books, and artwork by the Venerable Shoyam Trungpa Rinpoche, founder of Shambhala Buddhism. And whereas the federal Conservative government's 2012 budget imposed dramatic cuts on Library and Archives Canada, which led to the elimination of the National Archives Development Program, a program which helped build up the resources of the Shambhala archives. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly calls on the Leader of the Conservative Party to lobby his federal counterparts and Conservative Party colleagues on the importance of funding to local small museums and archives, and warn them about the impact that these cuts will have on heritage institutions and their ability to preserve, protect, and showcase important historical and culturally significant artifacts. Mr. Speaker, they've taken the progressive out of Conservative. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. I will now recognize the honourable member for Preston on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seated in the West Gallery, it gives me a great privilege to introduce Mrs. Laura Day, better known as Mrs. Buddy Day, a former Sergeant-at-Arms in this legislature some time ago until he passed away in the mid-90s. And with her today are her two daughters, Melinda Day and Leslie Day. And I would ask them to rise and accept a warm reception from the legislature.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the heritage sector is a very important part of Nova Scotia's creative economy, and our museums, art galleries, and archives are valued not only by Nova Scotians but by Canadians. And whereas the Cole Harbour Rural Heritage Society was founded in 1973 with the express goal to record and preserve what they could of the area's agricultural and natural heritage, and in doing so operate the Cole Harbour Heritage Farm Museum and Archives. And whereas the federal Conservative government's 2012 budget has seen dramatic cuts at Library and Archives Canada, which has led to the elimination of the National Archival Development Program, a program which was to fund archival work at the Cole Harbour Heritage Farm Museum. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly call on the members of the Conservative Party to lobby their federal counterparts and Conservative Party colleagues on the importance of funding to local and small museums and archives and the impact that these cuts will have on these institutions' ability to preserve, protect, and showcase Nova Scotia's important rural and agricultural heritage. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the heritage sector is a very important part of Nova Scotia's creative economy, and our museums, art galleries, and archives are valued not only by Nova Scotians but by Canadians. And whereas the Argyll Township Courthouse and Archives, which is owned and supported by the Municipality of Argyll and operated by the Argyll Municipality Historical and Genealogical Society, with the mission to preserve, protect, promote, and make available to the public the historic courthouse and the public records of the Municipality of Argyll. And whereas the federal Conservative government's 2012 budget has seen dramatic cuts at Library and Archives Canada, which have led to the elimination of the National Archival Development Program, a program which has funded many projects at the Argyll Township Courthouse and Archives, one of which was the complete arrangement and description of municipal records for Argyll from 1987 to 2000. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly calls on the member of Argyll to lobby his federal counterparts and Conservative Party colleagues on the importance of funding to local small museums and archives and the impact that these cuts will have on these institutions' ability to preserve, protect, and showcase Nova Scotia's important rural and agricultural heritage. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the heritage sector is a very important part of Nova Scotia's creative economy, and our museums, art galleries, and archives are valued not only by Nova Scotians, but by all Canadians. And whereas the Celtic Music Interpretive Centre, Archives and Resource Library in Judique, Inverness County, collects, preserves, and promotes the traditional Celtic music of Cape Breton Island through education, research, and performance. And whereas the federal Conservative government's 2012 budget has seen dramatic cuts at Library and Archives Canada, which have led to the elimination of the National Archival Development Program, a program which has assisted the development of an archives for the preservation of important documents related to Celtic music in Cape Breton. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly calls on the member from Inverness to lobby his federal counterparts and Conservative Party colleagues on the importance of funding to local small museums and archives and the impact that these cuts will have on these institutions' ability to preserve, protect, and showcase Nova Scotia's musical tradition. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax, Shabukto.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 28th is marked each year as the International Day of Mourning for Workers Killed on the Job. And whereas Kathleen Flanagan, a noted local photographer, created an exhibit of photographs of monuments located throughout Nova Scotia placed in memory of workers killed on the job. And whereas the exhibit, Sacrifices on the Job, honouring Nova Scotians killed at work, opened April 28th in Alderney Landing, Dartmouth, and includes photographs of the monuments to John Michael Rossiter, the paramedic killed during Hurricane Juan, and William Davis, killed during protests over mining conditions, and of the monument placed to the miners killed 20 years ago today in the Westray mine explosion. Therefore, be it resolved that this House acknowledges the skill and dedication of photographer Kathleen Flanagan and thanks her for her exhibit, Sacrifices on the Job, honouring Nova Scotians killed at work. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Eastern Shore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Heritage Society is a very important part of Nova Scotia creative economy, and our museums, art galleries, archives are valued not only by Nova Scotians, by all Canadians. Whereas the Lake Charlotte Heritage Society was founded in 1995 and owns and operates Memory Lane Heritage Village Museum and archives chronicling the history of the community of Lake Charlotte, Ship Harbour, DeBay's Cove, Owl's Head, Little Harbour, Clam Bay, Upper Lakeville, and Oyster Pond. East and West Eudora. And whereas the federal Conservative government's 2012 budget has seen the pullback of nearly $100,000 in funding to the Museum for Tourism Development from Ocoa, closed the museum's cap site and cut funding to the Society's archives with elimination of the National Archive Development Program. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly calls on members of the Conservative Party to lobby their federal counterparts, Conservative Party colleagues, on the importance of funding to local small museums and archives and impact those cuts will have on this institution's ability to preserve, protect and showcase Nova Scotia's important heritage and culture. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Inverness.
Speaker, whereas in January I wrote a letter to the Provincial Minister of Culture to allocate funds for regional archives, and whereas I recommended approaching the federal government about obtaining partnership funding in advance of our country's 150th anniversary so that we can remember important local history for generations to come. And whereas this NDP government Minister of Culture has yet to respond to that letter 4 months later, therefore be it resolved that this NDP government get their cultural and historical priorities straight and advance them in a spirit of cooperation with our federal government in Ottawa before criticizing other levels of government. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Lunenburg West.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ms. Roseanne Himmelman was a graduate of Parkview Education Centre in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, who went on to Mount St. Vincent University to achieve a bachelor's degree in commerce, following which she began her career with Heinz Canada, becoming regional sales manager for Western Canada. And whereas in 2001, Ms. Himmelman contracted cancer, causing her to leave her career and return to her home in Wildville, Nova Scotia, to live with her family, at which time she often spoke to them of her desire to set up a foundation that would help other families impacted by cancer. And whereas through her efforts and the efforts of family and friends, the Rose Fund Society established the Rose Fund to fulfill her wishes to help others with cancer, creating an annual fundraising dinner and auction, the 2012 event having been held on Saturday, May 5th at the Royal Canadian Legion in Bridgewater to the delight of a capacity crowd, raising much-needed funds to continue support for cancer patients. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the selflessness and courage of Miss Roseanne Himmelman, who, even while suffering herself, could only think of others, and congratulate her family and friends in the Rose Fund Society for creating a mechanism which continues to make her dream become a reality. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice of passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cumberland Regional Healthcare Auxiliary celebrates the 30th anniversary of their Highland Fling Spring fundraising event.
That's not that easy to do.
With a goal of raising $30,000 this month. The ribbon cutting ceremony having taken place May the 7th. And whereas the Cumberland Regional Healthcare Auxiliary has been successful in raising over $500,000 because of the strength and commitment of their volunteers throughout the years and the willingness of many local community groups to help make this event a success. And whereas the people of Cumberland County recognize the benefits of the fundraising efforts of the Cumberland Regional Healthcare Auxiliary and continue to appreciate and support their efforts to make the community of Cumberland County a better place to live. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly join me in saying thank you to all of those who have worked so hard for the last 30 years to make the Highland Fling a success, and wish them good luck on reaching their goal of $30,000 this year. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Community Access Program assists communities in offering public internet access sites and trains local citizens to make use of information technologies for social and economic benefit to the individual and to the community. And whereas there are 209 CAP sites throughout the province that ensure Nova Scotians have secure and reliable internet access in their community for job searches, filing government forms, banking, and recreational use. And whereas the Conservatives' recent announcement that they will no longer support this community-based program will cause hardship for those Nova Scotians from all parts of the province who rely on CAP sites for internet access, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House, especially the members from Argyll, Hants West, Inverness, Victoria the Lakes, Cape Breton West, Cape Breton North, and Cumberland South, make it clear to the Conservatives that they do not support their cuts to these important local resources, and ask them to reconsider their rash decision to isolate rural Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Oh, I'm sorry, motion is tabled. It is now 3:01. We will start orders of the day, oral question put by members to minister. We will finish at 4:31. I will now recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, May 4th marked the launch of the long-awaited Afrocentric Learning Institute. This institute was born out of the recommendations adopted by the government in 2003, the Black Learners Advisory Committee Implementation Review Report. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Education tell members of this House what this institute will be called?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for bringing up such an important institute today. The Afrocentric Learning Institute was launched on this Friday, and it was a key recommendation of the Black Report. This is going to be a wonderful resource for our province, and it's the first of its kind in Canada. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston.
Mr.
On his
Speaker,
first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the government's response to the report's recommendation states, quote, and I will table that document, the ALI has officially become the Desmore Buddy Day Afrocentric Learning Institute, end quote, and I will table that document. In the letter from the Minister of Education dated May 2nd, inviting the Day family to the May 4th launch, called it the Delmore Buddy Day Afrocentric Learning Institute, and I will table that letter as well. Will the Minister tell members of this House why, in the 2003 report and on the letter of May the 2nd letter, it was called the Desmore Buddy Day Institute, but the institute itself was incorporated into the Afrocentric Learning Institute?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Afrocentric Learning Institute, which was launched this Friday, is going to be a resource for all of our teachers and for our students here in Nova Scotia. I have to say that I did not know Mr. Day. I did not meet him, but I know that Mr. Day was instrumental in making sure that all people in the legislature, all parties, move forward the advancement of appropriate education for our Black learners in the province of Nova Scotia. And I have heard nothing but his commitment and his passion and dedication towards children of African descent receiving appropriate education. And Mr. Speaker, I recognize that there have been difficulties in the past, and we are continuing with difficulties. And this institute is going to be a resource that will help us along our journey to make sure that our students in this province get an appropriate education. Thank you.
The honourable member for Preston on his final supplementary.
Well, I have to ask the minister why she wrote the letter then of May the 4th, the 2nd. The letter clearly said that this was going to be the Delmore Buddy Day Afrocentric Learning Institute. And the community, the black community, even went to the length of going all over this province checking to see if the name would be acceptable, and it was by everyone that they met with in the province. So will the Minister of Education take this opportunity today to apologize to the Day family and to those who have worked so hard for Mr. Day's memory to see the Institute becomes a reality, and to all members of this House for insulting this name change?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to say that past ministers and past boards wanted to recognize Mr. Day's contributions, but it has come to our attention that there's some conflicting information on the public record that needs to be sorted out. And there has been a new board established on Friday, and I'm sure that the new board will be able to sort this information out. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Yesterday, I tabled a statement from the Premier when he was in opposition in his House, where he said, and I quote again, "When the price of power starts to outstrip consumers' ability to pay, it's time for the government to step in. It's time for government to provide leadership and solutions." Well, Mr. Speaker, as we know, power rates continue to skyrocket in this province under this government, and at the same time, the disposable income of Nova Scotians has declined, most recently by 1.8%. My question to the Premier, why has he decided that it is no longer the responsibility of government to provide leadership when the price of power outstrips consumers' ability to pay? And I'll again table that statement of
the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I saw the statement yesterday when it was tabled by the Leader of the Conservative Party. He neglects to say that in the press release that he actually tables, that I actually point out the two things that should happen in order to show leadership, Mr. Speaker. This says two things that have to happen. First, Nova Scotia Power must move quickly to use more renewables, renewable energy like wind and tidal power. And secondly, help consumers with the one big thing they cannot do, which is conserve the amount of power they use. Mr. Speaker, that is the exact program of government that we have laid out. We are doing exactly what we said we would do.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you'll have to forgive Nova Scotians who, when they heard the Premier tell them that when the price of power outstrips their ability to pay, that it's the government's job to step in, that they didn't notice that that promise, like so many others from him, contained a big magic asterisk, contained two conditions that he's now disclosing that were not part of the deal at the time, that he only means it under certain conditions, like the HST promise, like the balanced budget promise. Now his power rate promise, we find out later, had conditions attached to it all along. But, Mr. Speaker, one of those conditions that he is hanging his hat on now is that consumption has to go down. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, according to Nova Scotia Power's filing yesterday, the average consumption for a Nova Scotia household in 2008 was 830 kilowatt hours of electricity. The average consumption today, after 3 years of this government, is 833 kilowatt hours of electricity. Consumption has not gone down, it has gone up, and yet our power prices continue to skyrocket, and it outstrips Nova Scotians' ability to pay, as the Premier had told them before the election. So my question to the Premier, why is he okay with skyrocketing power bills now when consumption has not gone down as he had put a condition on his earlier promise?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess unlike the Leader of the Conservative Party, most Nova Scotians can actually read. They can read the whole text, Mr. Speaker. They in fact, Mr. Speaker, endorse the agenda of this government by voting for them. The most important decision they could make, Mr. Speaker. And more to the point is he uses 2008 as a year for comparison, knowing full well that Efficiency Nova Scotia was not in place at that time, and knowing full well that Alan Crandallmeyer appeared before the Public Accounts Committee and pointed out to the members opposite that more than $100 million in conservation savings were passed on to ratepayers as a result of their work.
Honourable, the Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately for the Premier, Nova Scotians can read very well. They can read the election platform of the NDP, which said he wouldn't raise their taxes, that he would balance the budget. It said he would not let power rates go up. And they can now read for themselves these new conditions that he places retroactively on his promises, like that it depended on consumption. Well, Mr. Speaker, consumption has not gone down, but power prices have certainly skyrocketed. The only place where consumption is down is in the industrial sector because of shutdowns at big companies like NewPage and like Bowater. And as we learned from the Nova Scotia Power filing yesterday, even consumption among other companies, large and small, is down, not because they honored the Premier's magic conditional promise, but because they can't afford to pay for power like they used to be able to afford to pay for power, Mr. Speaker. The one place where consumption is down is in manufacturing, where jobs matter, where jobs are important, where jobs can be maintained. Here is a great example of where the Premier's electricity plan is actually reducing consumption by killing jobs in the manufacturing sector. And so my question to the Premier is, how many more shutdowns and job losses does he have to see before he admits his plan isn't working and he does show leadership and step in on behalf of Nova Scotians who can't afford their power bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians know, and I hear it from them almost every day, is that unfortunately, because of decisions made by past governments, Nova Scotians, whether they are in the industrial sector or in the residential sector, are chained to the international fossil fuel market as a result of decisions made by those governments. We have higher electricity prices because of the decisions that previous governments made.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you. I'll try to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are paying some of the highest rates for power in Canada, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia Power has gone back to the URB to try and exact more money from family and businesses. Nova Scotians have had enough, Mr. Speaker, and they're looking for this government to stand up to Nova Scotia Power. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier end Nova Scotia Power's monopoly to ensure competition with better regulations?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have seen the results of deregulations in other parts of the country. What has happened with deregulation is it has actually driven up the cost of power for ordinary consumers. Unfortunately, the members of the Liberal Party believe that embarking on a deregulated market will somehow benefit ratepayers when in fact what it would do is harm them.
Order, please. Order, please. I'd ask the honourable member to retract those remarks that I just heard. The honourable member from Yarmouth, stand in your place, please.
Retracted, Mr. Speaker.
What you said.
What I said, yes.
Yes. Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to be clear that at no time has the Liberal caucus ever suggested there should be deregulation, Mr. Speaker. What we've allowed for competition to happen in a regulated market, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Premier of all the provinces that he's quoting, they have cheaper power than we do here in Nova Scotia. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, is that the NDP government is afraid to stand up against Nova Scotia Power, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they're afraid to allow competition in the energy market, Mr. Speaker, so Nova Scotians can get an opportunity to have choice when it comes to who supplies their household with power, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they have the ability to put in a regulated market to allow competition inside the province of Nova Scotia. So my question for the Premier, why does the Premier continue to stand up for Nova Scotia Power instead of standing up for Nova Scotians?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we are standing up for ratepayers. We removed the HST from home electricity, something that member and his entire caucus voted against, Mr. Speaker. I want to point out to the Leader of the Opposition that he should talk to his energy critic, because I will table again the legislation that he tabled, which calls for the deregulation of the electricity market, and I will table a copy of the news report of the day when that legislation was tabled in New Brunswick, which says it's all about the deregulation of the market, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest before the Premier starts chastising the Leader of the Conservative Party about being able to read, I would suggest he goes back to literacy class, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, in actual fact, that bill that was put in front of this House does not talk about deregulation, Mr. Speaker, and I can't help, nor can this caucus help, what is written in New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. But what this government can do, is keep their word, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since this government is unable and powerless to stand up against Nova Scotia Power, perhaps it could give Nova Scotians a break on their power bill each and every month by doing what they said they would do before the last election, and that would be to force shareholders to pay for the NDP electricity tax and not ratepayers.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we took tax off of electricity, not put it on, Mr. Speaker. What he wants to do, Mr. Speaker, is try and confuse consumers by telling them that the $100 million in energy savings that they received for the $40 million that were paid is not a good deal, Mr. Speaker. The $40 million of that money is recovered for $100 million worth of savings.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the, my question is for the Premier, since he wants to get so angry about this, since he can't get his facts right yet. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, in response to a question from the member for Glace Bay, the Minister of Economic Development, his minister, said that some businesses in the province may be concerned about skyrocketing costs about power rates in the province, but he didn't think it was really a big issue. So I'm going to table that. There in the follow-up supplementary to the Minister of Energy, he said he knows people are concerned about energy rates in the province, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, which minister is right?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're all concerned about the cost of electricity, anything that affects the people's quality of life or the ability for a business to function. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we have embarked on a program, one that was widely lauded throughout the industry, an electricity plan that will invest $1.5 billion over the next number of years in order to make improvements into the electricity grid that will mean that this province will finally be taken off of fossil fuels, placed on renewables, so that we have stable long-term pricing. Mr. Speaker, that's not just a goal, that is something that this government is actually doing.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, before the Premier starts blaming the other parties for the reliance on coal in this province, he might want to talk to the member for Cape Breton Centre, who lobbied hard for coal in this House and as an NDP MLA. And we tabled lots of that the other day. So, Mr. Speaker, all three parties were fighting for coal in this province, including members of the NDP. You know, Mr. Speaker, the NDP ministers stand in this House day after day, and they take credit for the amazing economic growth in this province that has happened since they took office. So amazing, in fact, it is 0.3% growth, the worst in Canada. Amazingly bad. Mr. Speaker, since the minister's cabinet colleague, the energy minister's colleague, said that there are only some businesses that may be concerned about skyrocketing power rates, and the Minister of Energy thought, well, maybe everybody is. Would the Premier please tell us which businesses in this province his cabinet colleagues feel aren't worried about power rates?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Mr. Speaker, we're 3 questions deep into question period, and he's already reduced to rhetoric, Mr. Speaker. That's because he has nothing left. He knows that it is this government, Mr. Speaker, that is standing up for its citizens, ensuring that we have stable long-term energy prices so that this will become an economic advantage for the people of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is worried about rhetoric and he gives that answer? I mean, that's unbelievable. You know, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, this Premier isn't standing up for ratepayers. He's standing up for Nova Scotia Power, the only company in the province that isn't concerned about rising power rates. You know, Mr. Speaker, let's take a look at some of these business users. The efficiency charge that the Premier said during the election they would charge against shareholders to get that $100 million in savings is increasing by 249% this year on bills. The rate is going up 249% in that application for industrial users. Now, the HST changes that this government likes to talk about were relevant to businesses. Were relevant to businesses because businesses it was a charge through anyways, so it doesn't matter. The minister talks about switching to renewables when he knows that the costs associated with those changes that we've paid up to now were from the Tory government's EGSPA legislation, and the NDP costs will come later. So, Mr. Speaker, what has this government done to reduce power rates, as they said was so important, for businesses in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have entered into agreements that will ensure stable long-term rates so that those will become an economic advantage for Nova Scotia businesses. The reality is that despite what has been said in the last couple of days, Nova Scotia does not have the highest power rates in the country. In fact, we're in the middle of the pack. And the other thing that's something that has been avoided by the something that has been avoided to be mentioned by the leaders of the other parties is simply this. We also have one of the lowest basic charges in the country.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the province's pulp and paper crisis is creating a spiraling electricity problem in our province. High electricity costs were cited as one of the 3 major cost drivers that were making it difficult for them to keep their doors open. Ironically, the shutdown leads to even higher energy prices. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Energy, will he rewrite his expensive electricity plan and replace it with one that sustains important manufacturing jobs rather than driving them away?
Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as was mentioned in the last question, that we are all concerned about the cost or the affordability of energy in this province, whether for a family or for a very large industry. We continue to work to find alternatives to expensive coal that has really been the cost driver of higher energy prices, thanks to previous governments. And we're working on a suite of alternatives from renewables to natural gas to efficiency programs to taking the HST off electricity, a whole suite of alternatives that will make electricity affordable in this province.
The honourable member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, year after year, these mills made big contributions to fixed costs of Nova Scotia's electricity system. They help pay the mortgage on the power plants, the wind turbines, the dams, and the power lines that have been built. But these mills exit the system. It's forcing everyone else to pay more to cover these fixed costs. It's a spiral effect that is just going to keep getting worse, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister of Energy tell us how many more jobs we will have to lose in rural Nova Scotia before he will admit his bite-the-bullet electricity plan is actually killing important manufacturing jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through our 2010 Renewable Electricity Plan, we have an outline of a better way for a better future, and working with large businesses, small businesses, families, renters, the whole gamut of Nova Scotians, and we have various programs under the efficiency model, Efficiency Nova Scotia model, that will help all of those ratepayers that I just mentioned.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in question period, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism said the cost of power may be an issue for some businesses. Well, Mr. Speaker, according to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses Business Barometer for March, the main cost pressure facing Nova Scotia businesses is fuel and energy, followed by taxes and regulation. And I'll table that document, Mr. Speaker. Under the NDP's watch, we have now the highest rate per kilowatt hour for power of all the provinces and some of the highest taxes, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister tell job creators which he would prefer them to do to deal with their rising cost pressures? Lay off more employees or pay their power bills?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, the real reason that energy prices are high is because of years of inaction by previous governments that just did not have a plan, did not have a vision and on the contrary, this government does have a plan. It's our renewable electricity plan. We're working towards renewables, working towards more natural gas, efficiency Nova Scotia programs. There's a whole suite of alternatives to help Nova Scotians, to help businesses in this province. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, today the province released a physician resource plan that confirmed, Mr. Speaker, what many others have been telling this government for quite some time, that we do not have a sufficient number of family physicians today, Mr. Speaker, and by 2020, the need will have grown by more than 120 physicians. While recruitment and retention is complex, it became clearly evident today what we've been doing in terms of recruitment and retention is not working. Given all of what has been confirmed today, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier, will the Premier commit to passing our bill which would set aside 20 medical seats at the Dalhousie Medical School for students who are willing to work in underserviced areas across our province?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the Minister of Health today had a press conference along with Doctors Nova Scotia, in which Doctors Nova Scotia talked about the great level of cooperation they had with the Minister of Health. I think she would like to respond directly to that question, so I'm going to ask her to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to ensuring that every Nova Scotian has access to a family doctor in primary care, regardless of where they live throughout our province. Today was a very good day for health care in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We are the first province to have a physician resource plan. We've worked very hard with our partners at the medical school, Doctors Nova Scotia, the college, the DHAs, and Mr. Speaker, we have the first steps moving us forward to expand primary care, 4 new primary health care centres in the province, financial assistance for 16 others, a new locum program to support emergency rooms. There are many, many excellent features in our new physician resource plan, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 3 years later, we have a plan, and Mr. Speaker, and 60,000 Nova Scotians are still waiting to have access to a family physician. Mr. Speaker, today, both Doctors Nova Scotia and Dal Med School talked about the need to introduce med students to the reality of rural practices, Mr. Speaker. 40 med schools throughout the world have comprehensive third-year clerkship programs that have been very successful in introducing students to the realities of rural medicine and then attracting these students, Mr. Speaker, back to the very communities in this province and other provinces who have difficulty accessing and recruiting family physicians. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier commit to passing our bill which would support Dalhousie Medical School so that they can implement a third-year comprehensive clerkship program?
Honourable the Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond to the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that this government will be doing this year is expanding the residency program from the medical school into the Annapolis Valley, where that member represents members of the public there. And we will work very closely with Dalhousie. Dalhousie have been a full partner in the development of the Physician Resource Plan, and they are very committed to working with the department and others to changing the mix of graduates that come out of their program to refocus into more family practice and more generalists that will be able to work throughout our province and take some of the pressure off the Capital District Health Authority and our ERs, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
What Dalhousie Medical School has been clear about is the fact that the clerkship residency program, Mr. Speaker, which has worked in other provinces, would be a tremendous asset to Nova Scotia. And that is different, Mr. Speaker. And that is different, Mr. Speaker, than the residency program that the minister is talking about. The clerkship program takes place in the 3rd and 4th year of studies, Mr. Speaker. The residency program takes after they graduate, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the residency program highlights another issue that happens in this province, Mr. Speaker, and in our country. There are 3,500 Canadians at any one time studying medical schools abroad, Mr. Speaker. About 100 Nova Scotians are part of that, Mr. Speaker. But when they look for a residency program, a residency seat in Nova Scotia, we treat them as foreign students. We do not show them the respect of treating them as one of our sons and daughters. Mr. Speaker, I would ask the Minister and the Premier to support our bill, which is in front of this House, which is to build a residency program that addresses the very need to support those sons and daughters of ours who are studying abroad in this province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Health just pointed out, there is an enhanced residency project underway that will expand the residency program in those areas of the Valley, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure now, though, that the Leader of the Opposition regrets the last Liberal government when they were making cuts to those things like seats.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nalcor and Emera deal on Muskrat Falls was due the end of January and is over 3 months late. Can't hear myself think, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I hear you.
Mr. Speaker, the Nalcor and Emera...
Listen carefully.
The Nalcor and Emera deal on Muskrat Falls was due the end of January, Mr. Speaker, and is over 3 months late. Through the current proposals, Nova Scotia would be entitled to about 160 megawatts of energy. However, the subsea cable is expected to hold up to more than 3 times that capacity. We see today that the Premier has finally come around to our caucus position that there needs to be a formal review of the project, but there are still many concerns about securing a market for the extra electricity. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Energy: has his department talked to Emera about markets for excess energy from Muskrat Falls, and what would that mean for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, the Muskrat Falls project is a real opportunity for Nova Scotia. It's going to provide 35 years of stable electricity rates for Nova Scotians, and that'll help small businesses, large business, families, and there will be a certain contracted amount of power available once the UARB decides on the format, but the extra power that's there that'll be available at market prices to Nova Scotians and beyond.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A market for the excess energy is key to helping that project get off the ground. Nova Scotia could benefit from moving that electricity through our province. But if there's no market willing to pay the premium price for electricity, then it becomes stranded here, forcing up power rates even more. My question to the Minister: has Emera asked the government to accept more than the 20% of our energy needs from Muskrat Falls to make sure there is a market for the expensive energy in order to force its deal with Nalcor to work?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Premier has been intimately involved in this project, I'm going to ask him to respond to it.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by pointing out that right from the very first day that the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, we said there would be a full review before the Utility and Review Board, something that today the legislation set out the terms of. Mr. Speaker, I would point out to the member opposite that we will have an entitlement to a certain set amount of electricity. The rest of that will continue to belong to the province of Newfoundland through their Crown agency, Nalcor. They will run that through into the competitive market in an enhanced transmission grid. That will also be good for the province of Nova Scotia. It's part of the reason that New Brunswick has been intricately involved in the overall transmission project. I would point out that one of the advantages for the province of Nova Scotia is that the transmission line that will be used to carry that extra electricity will actually charge a tolling rate on the electricity as it passes through, which will help underwrite the cost of the transmission system.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Maine has an excess of cheap natural gas, fueled electricity, and there is not yet a link to the more profitable markets in Boston or New York. They may have no reason to buy more expensive electricity, and I bet customers in New England won't buy Muskrat Falls energy without knowing the cost. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, is he committed to even more electricity for Muskrat Falls without knowing how much it cost?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one of the great benefits of Muskrat Falls is, as I said, we're going to get a guaranteed rate for 35 years for the amount of electricity that is contracted for, Mr. Speaker. The cost will be based on the cost of the project, which will be reviewed by the Utility and Review Board, Mr. Speaker, which of course is the way that every project is analyzed for the ratepayer's rate. But the great advantage to this will be that in addition to that, the extra power will flow through into a competitive market, and then the province of Nova Scotia will have the opportunity to buy the most competitively priced power on the market.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Mental Health Commission released a national mental health strategy. For Nova Scotia, this means we now have a national strategy waiting for a response. Recommendations from a provincial advisory committee that have yet to be formulated into a provincial action plan, and DHAs who have been implementing their own mental health strategies, all in a vacuum. Could the minister please indicate how the Federal Mental Health Commission strategy will be incorporated with the provincial and DHA strategies?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for an excellent question. Mr. Speaker, on the working group for Nova Scotia's Mental Health Advisory Committee was a young man whose name is Andy Cox, who's also on the working group for the National Mental Health Strategy. Our co-chair for our working group, our advisory group, Dr. Michael Unger, was also involved with the development of the National Mental Health Strategy. I think, in fact, Nova Scotia probably is the best represented province on the National Mental Health Working Groups. Louise Bradshaw, who is the Executive Director of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, the staff person is formerly from the Capital District Health Authority and has set up many of the mental health programs in this province. And the Deputy Minister of Health in the Department of Health and Wellness has also been very active on the national file. So we're very aware of what is in the national strategy and are working hard to ensure that that strategy and our own is aligned. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Unlike the provincial advisory recommendations, the federal strategy comes with a funding recommendation to increase mental health funding from the national average of 7% to 9% of health budgets. Mr. Speaker, when you look at the national average of 7%, Nova Scotia doesn't reach that mark. Our funding is short by over $94 million. To get to 9%, we need to add at least another $171 million. Given the absence of any provincial funding recommendation from the Provincial Advisory Committee, will the Minister of Health and Wellness confirm whether they will be accepting the federal funding recommendations?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what financial metrics the member is using, but in Nova Scotia, we are either at or very close to 7% of the budget. Well, I hear the member from Clayton Park saying it's not true, but I asked Mr. Speaker, members of my department in the finance to break out where we spend our budget to establish, and in fact, I have that information, and it is the case that we are very close to the 7%. Mr. Speaker, we have indicated that we have set aside close to $4 million for our mental health strategy in the coming year, and we will continue to look at the kinds of resources we need to invest in mental health services as we go forward. The mental health strategy is expected in the next few weeks, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to having some support in implementing the mental health strategy from all members of this House.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, mental health and addiction spending as a percentage of the overall budget is 4.6%, and mental health spending alone as a percentage of the overall budget is 3.5%. And I can table that for the minister. The final supplementary, then in January, premiers met, formed a healthcare innovation group to look at scopes of practice, human resource management, and clinical practical guidelines. All great directions, but none speak directly to the need for more funding. The report will be discussed in Halifax in July. In March, our Premier was quoted in the Globe and Mail as stating, "Our role as Premiers is not simply to blindly accept whatever the federal government says. Ours is to continue to make the case." I don't think there's a person in the House or even outside this House that doesn't believe that the Premier can't make the case for the federal government to provide more funding for mental health. My question to the Premier, as the new chair of the Federation of the Council, could the Premier please indicate when he will be contacting his respective provincial counterparts to make the case for more federal funding for mental health?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the member meant the Council of the Federation. I get his point. In fact, all the premiers are trying to bring to the attention of all Canadians what is happening in healthcare funding generally, which of course reflects very directly on the question of mental health funding. Simple fact of the matter is that although the federal government likes to talk about the 6% escalator, they don't often say that that is only with respect to a very small pool of money that comes from the federal government to the provinces. What that means is that in our province, it amounts to about 1.2% of the healthcare budget in terms of an increase. In fact, the federal government's funding is now, I think this year, will slip below 15% of the total funding for the healthcare system, and we can see very soon it will go down below 10% of the total funding for the healthcare system. This is an extraordinary set of circumstances. So, of course, we intend to argue, intend to push the federal government for additional funding.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Acting Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
There's a $2,000 question.
This government wants to keep the process around the Ship Start Here rule-breaking advertising contract secret. On March the 8th, our caucus, the Progressive Conservative Caucus, submitted a FOIPOP application to the Department of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism asking for the minutes of the Ship Start Here Steering Committee meetings, a group that met a handful of times. On April the 11th, we learned that the department decided to extend the 30-day response time. Now, this is for a simple set of minutes sitting in a binder somewhere, Mr. Speaker, and then the application for an additional 30 days to May 11th, so that we are only a couple of days away from that date. So today, we learned that that won't happen, that the person responsible for meeting the deadline was given time off by this government so that we won't hear the truth, and they don't want to hear the truth before this session is over. So my question to the minister is this. Will the minister ensure that ERDT meets its obligation and delivers the information about ship starts here before the Friday deadline?
Honourable the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the member opposite is confused about the reasoning for the Ship Start Here campaign, but simply put, Mr. Speaker, this is the biggest economic opportunity the province has ever seen in its history. And what we need is support from all members of this House as we move forward and implement that Ship Starts Here campaign and program and the awardment of that ship's contract, Mr. Speaker. This government is supportive of it. I just wish that party over there would support it also.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my first supplementary will be to the Minister of CNS. Part of Communications Nova Scotia mission is to working as a team, we bring projects to life from concept to design and budget through to a successful launch. And we learned today that when it comes to the Ship Starts Here, this government kept the concept and design a secret from CNS, but stuck them with the tab. So my question to the minister is this. If the Ship Starts Here campaign was not a political campaign in nature, why did the government bypass the able professionals at CNS and use an outside agency that is mandated to make a profit and not use CNS, who is accountable to the taxpayers?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission and Communications Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But to the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we've taken more contracts in the House rather than when that crowd was in government, Mr. Speaker, where they put out. I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Speaker. Since we came to power, at Communications Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, the budget has gone down over 27% since we took over, and we picked up what these people put by the curb. We made the difference, Mr. Speaker. We look after the taxpayers' dollars. They wasted them, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Would be a good waste of breath and time, that answer. Mr. Speaker, this morning the Assistant Deputy Minister told members of the Public Accounts Committee that the Ship Starts Here campaign was intended to instill pride in Nova Scotians.
You never heard the rest yet.
She also said, Mr. Speaker, the 811 campaign reaped tangible results by increasing the number of calls to that service. She could not, however, Mr. Speaker, she could not point to one single tangible result stemming from the Ship Starts Here campaign. Now, my question to the minister. Not one.
Question?
I do have a question. I'm just waiting for the time to get. I don't want the minister to miss it, sir.
That's all right.
Will the minister now admit that the taxpayer-funded Ship Starts Here campaign was little more than a political PR campaign aimed at boosting the political fortunes of a government who has the highest taxes, among the highest power rates, and the second lowest growth rate in the province of
the Honourable Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia.
You know, Mr. Speaker, proof that this is working. You know, Mr. Speaker, I've got a picture here, and I'm going to table, and it's not a poster for the blockbuster Three Stooges movie that's coming out this summer, Mr. Speaker, but it is for the member of Argyll, the member from Hants East, and the member from Cape Breton North, standing proudly behind Ship Starts Here logos, Mr. Speaker. That's why it works. They know it works. We know it works. All Nova Scotia works. Why don't they just agree to us, Mr. Speaker, and we'll move forward?
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday questions were asked to the Minister of Health regarding the protocols used at the Nova Scotia Forensic Hospital dealing with unescorted leave passes. Mr. Speaker, we're now aware that the patient in question who failed to return on Friday night is still missing. In light of the Denny incident mere weeks ago, which led to an unfortunate murder in our province, I'm wondering if the Minister of Health could advise why, in this case, the Minister still waited 72 hours before notifying the public when the patient failed to return.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows, there's a criminal review board that reviews the information, the medical information, and makes a determination about individuals with respect to the risk they pose to the community. And they lay out parameters for the doctors and nurses to work within in terms of a treatment plan and a release plan for that individual. And that was the case with this particular young woman. She's been at the forensic hospital for close to a year. She's had numerous passes into the community. She was granted a pass on the Friday in question, and when she failed to return, the procedures that are in place in terms of informing the police were followed, and then subsequently informing the public. And all procedures that exist were followed, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one would say that all the procedures were followed in the Denny incident as well, and we know the most unfortunate result of that case. Mr. Speaker, we've been through this just a few weeks ago, and we've seen what can happen. And today we're now hearing the minister, even after the Denny incident, decided the very protocols she says have been followed are the ones her department is reviewing to see if they're actually the appropriate protocols. But what we now know today, Mr. Speaker, the department waited 72 hours to notify the public. Halifax Regional Police today are saying that they suspect that the patient in question is now in the province of Quebec, which Nova Scotians have to ask, had they been notified earlier, could the public have assisted the police and the government in trying to locate this patient and make sure that she returns to the facility to receive the treatment that she needs? So in light of the fact that Halifax Regional Police now believe that the patient is in the province of Quebec, would the Minister of Health please tell us whether she still believes waiting 72 hours to notify the public was a prudent call?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday in question period, on a daily basis, we may have anywhere between 10 to 15 patients who are at East Coast Forensic receiving some form of leave from the forensic hospital. And these procedures are there to be used in the event that someone leaves the facility and doesn't return. Police are notified within 15 minutes of the failure for an individual to return. If a person is AWOL for a longer period of time, it is their procedure to notify the public within 72 hours. They do have the flexibility to notify the public earlier if they feel that there is a risk to the public, and those decisions are made in consultation with the police department. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Speaker, the facts speak for themselves. We had a system which was brought to Nova Scotians' attention, a system that probably few Nova Scotians even understood how it worked until the Denny incident. The government did react by saying they would order a review, and one would have suspected that the government would have put in place interim measures while waiting for the review to try to ensure that this would not have happened again. Instead, today we're being told that the very same procedures that's currently under review were applied in this case to a patient that we're now being told has made her way to the province of Quebec and is now even further away from receiving the treatment that she deserves. I would add, Mr. Speaker, I would prefer that the Premier would take the safety of patients and the safety of Nova Scotians seriously in this province and implement immediate measures to do so, rather than sit and wait until incidents happen and then provide excuses. Like, you know, Mr. Speaker, for the Premier again.
Order. 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 The honourable member for Richmond has the floor.
No, Mr. Speaker, it's most unfortunate the Premier doesn't take this matter seriously and would not put more attention to this very matter. Mr. Speaker, we've seen a very unfortunate incident. Nova Scotians are now being told to wait for a review, only to see how long that will take before implementing changes. So I would ask the Minister of Health again, in light of this second incident and the fact that we're being told this patient is in the province of Quebec, what immediate changes, temporary changes, will this government implement to try to ensure that these incidents do not happen again?
Honourable the Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, in my judgment, it is not appropriate to suspend the treatment of mental health patients in the forensic hospital or the charter rights of mental health patients in a forensic hospital because we had a tragic incident. We all recognize there was a very tragic incident in our community. And we are doing a review of the procedures, and we are doing a review of the clinical oversight with respect to what occurred around that incident. But, Mr. Speaker, we have many, many mental health patients in the forensic hospital on treatment plans, subject to the review board. And because we've had this incident, we cannot now say that they will not be able to leave the forensic hospital, to go to school, to work, to visit family, to have a weekend home, or any of those things. These are the treatment plans that are in place, and for most of the people who are in that facility, these treatment plans are working the way they are intended, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, women's organizations are concerned about the specific impact that health policy, namely mental health policy, has on women who experience domestic violence. In a report for the Canadian Women's Foundation, the BC Society of Transition Houses notes that women's experience of violence precipitates their mental health issues. The report revealed that 50% of all women surveyed who had experienced violence had a clinical mental health diagnosis, compared to only 20% of women who had not experienced violence, and I'll table that report. The women's organizations have raised these concerns with the Department of Health and Wellness and in focus groups. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Health please tell the members of this House if she has heard the concerns from women's organizations, and if so, was the Mental Health and Addiction Strategy Advisory Committee directed to address these concerns in its recommendations?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Domestic violence is certainly of concern to myself and to this government. I am aware of the correlation between mental health disorders and issues and domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the working group advising on the mental health strategy held public consultations all over the province. Mr. Speaker, they met with more than 1,200 individuals and people representing various organizations. And as I indicated earlier today, their work and recommendations are quite comprehensive. and the strategy will follow quite closely. The department are very much involved across departments, working with justice, status of women, and other departments of government, community services, in having a very comprehensive response to domestic violence in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
And yet, Mr. Speaker, after all those consultations, the words domestic violence, we can't find them in the report. Women's organizations have concerns about the lack of consideration for domestic violence in the Mental Health and Addiction Strategy Advisory Committee's report. The Domestic Violence Action Plan clearly outlines the connection between domestic violence and mental health. Organizations therefore naturally expected to see something in the mental health strategy recommendations about domestic violence. To the Minister, how has your department addressed the concerns in the Domestic Violence Action Plan that specifically speak to mental health, and will these items be included in the mental health strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the work of the working group is to be congratulated, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure if the honourable member is suggesting that the working group needed to address every single solitary issue that exists in the province. What we have is a very comprehensive working group underway across government departments, looking at domestic violence and all of the various departments' roles in addressing domestic violence. And I'm sure that as that work unfolds, there will be attention given to access to mental health services and supports for victims of domestic violence, as well as perpetrators of domestic violence.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So either we're being nitpicky because we asked the minister to include recommendations on domestic violence, or it's a broad report. I can't really tell because she said both things. Mr. Speaker, women's organizations are concerned about the lack of mention of domestic violence in this report. The Domestic Violence Action Plan is under the purview of the Minister of Justice and the Minister for Status of Women. My question to the Minister of Health: did your cabinet colleagues raise any concern about the lack of mention of domestic violence in the Mental Health and Addiction Strategy Committee's recommendations?
Order, please. You cannot ask questions about the cabinet. It's confidentiality, so I'd ask you to reframe your question and ask it again, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did anyone on the opposite side of the House raise any concern about the lack of mention of domestic violence in the Mental Health and Addiction Strategy Committee's recommendations? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, this government is very committed to developing good public policy with respect to